Looking at Twitter, I am generally starting to think I am the only person who actually understands the current England setup. And I wonder if it's because England's going through a kind of experiment of what happens when you put someone who's less of a football manager and more of an academic, psychologist, and politician in charge of a national team. Well, I'd say it's an experiment that seems to be going pretty well. And maybe that's the problem, because strange enough, people interested in football see things in a footballing light. But I think in this context, you need to start seeing it in the light of an academic, a psychologist, and a politician. Because once you understand the history of the psychology and the politics, how they entwine and effectively make the whole current setup that we see in England, then all of those bizarre decisions, all those mysteries suddenly start to make sense. You also start to notice that no coincidence is a coincidence. And I think the fact that you can take the theory, apply some numbers, and create a mathematical algorithm that can predict every England squad accurately and better than most England football fans can, well, surely that should say something. And I'm not trying to say that I'm the best person to explain this, but let's say for someone who has an interest in politics and trained as a PE teacher, who wrote their entire dissertation as a research project on the effects of confidence on performance, I think I might be able to shed a little bit of light that perhaps other people can't. And it's the thing I was trying to put into one video, but it was getting so long. But then when you start looking at social media, I realised if I were to break it down to 4 parts and work on answering 4 questions that have been most frequently asked, then I might be able to really explain everything, but in more bite-size and palatable chunks. And the 4 questions being: 1, why have the FA been so desperate to renew Gav's contract by 2 years? 2, why do some players seem to play better for England than they do for their own clubs? 3, how has Callum Hudson-Odoi effectively blacklisted himself from the England senior team? Because, sorry, he has. 4, why does Gav keep picking his favourites? Because I don't think it's quite as simple as that. And while these might not seem connected, I promise you they are. So, starting with number 1. Why have the FA been so desperate to renew Gav's contract by 2 years? Because while everyone else is debating and disputing whether Gav's the right person to lead England forward and whether he should have this contract in the first place, I just feel I've completely overmissed all the things that I've been questioning. Because for me, as soon as Gav said that he wanted to negotiate his contract, well, then I knew something was up and I knew I had to do some digging. And I think for me, just seeing the FA as a whole, it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out very, very soon. And the reason I think this question is the best place to start is, in order for you to understand how I got to this point, you have to understand the history and the politics of the FA. And once you get that, everything else kind of just sort of fits into place afterwards. There's another reason as well, which is there's one line in that press conference which I really think sums up the starting point of where that mindset needs to change. It's about the 12th minute, and Gav's asked about why he wasn't interested in taking one of the Premier League jobs. And he wants to say that he's more interested in continuing the job, the role he's in now. But it's not the wording he uses, because this is what he says instead.
But I was very happy to commit to a project I really believe in, where I feel really well supported.
See, not a job, not a role, but a project. Because I think that's how Gareth sees himself. He doesn't just see himself as the England manager, he sees himself as leading this far bigger project within the FA as a whole. One that's based on like a 10-year plan between 2012 to 2022, plus there's a 2-year building plan before that. Which is why I think that analogy of an iceberg is just so applicable. Because if you look at the England team as just the England team, well, then you're just looking at the iceberg from surface level. While if you look at those changes we've seen in the England team over the last 5 years, as a small part of a long list of changes that's happened in the FA, then you start to see that bigger picture. And then suddenly, all of those mysteries start to make more sense. I like the word project. It's a new one for me. You'll see as I explain all of this that it's referenced to in quite a few ways. I would say the vision is the most commonly used over the years. There's also the system and coming through the system, although that generally relates to one particular part. But then Gareth is usually a lot more discreet. For example, when asked about his contract straight after the San Marino game, this is how he referenced it.
I think the team buy into what we're doing. We can still get better.
And whether you're buying into what we're trying to do, the vision, the system, or any of those other expressions that are used, they are all referring to the same thing. Unluckily, while Gareth has been quite discreet, Sir Trevor Brooking hasn't. Sir Trevor Brooking, basically being the orchestrator, the initiator of this plan, is actually also the only person who's explained it in detail and openly. And it's his interview from July I know I'll be referencing to a lot, because he's the only person that specifically says how
it was a 10-year plan from 2012. We're a year short at the moment, but it was about plan.
And the purpose of this 10-year plan is to answer one big question. How do you get a team of English players who have all been playing for months at different clubs, with different managers, with different philosophies and styles, to suddenly come together in the matter of about 4 days and start playing as one unit? Well, the answer is quite simple. You start at the junior level and then you bring it through to the senior level. This isn't anything new. This is what most of Europe have been doing for like decades. And actually, most of what's been copied is that it's been copied from Spain, Italy, or specifically Germany between 2008 and 2014. What Gareth and Sir Trevor Brooke and a few others did in 2012 was essentially say to the FA, you've got it all wrong, and we're going to show you how to do it. This is something, again, that's completely overlooked. I mean, if you take that documentary by ITV back in, I think, January, called The Evolution of England under Gareth Southgate, they also only start their story as late as 2016. And this storyline of the accidental manager who just happened to fall into the job, and at a time when we had talent coming through, well, it's not quite true. I mean, whether he knew it or not, Gareth had been lined up to be the next England manager as early as 2013. There were just a few hiccups with timing along the way. And when we get to 2018 with the World Cup, we're not in the second year, we are in the 8th year. And that's how it seemed like Gareth managed to make this massive turnaround in a mere 18 months. Because it hadn't been 18 months, it had been 7.5 years into the process. The reason for the discretion throughout, I think really though, can be found right at the very beginning of the story. I mean, right at the beginning of the story, in 2004, when Sir Trevor Brooking first joins the FA. I mean, just look at what he's talking about in articles and interviews in the noughties. All of these things are things that we're very familiar with in the current England setup. And he's talking about this as early as 2007, 2008. The problem he had is he was described as the thorn in the FA side. He knew what the changes needed to be, but he just couldn't get them through. He was constantly blocked by the powers that be and the old guard within the FA. It's only in 2010, when he meets a certain Gareth Southgate, he realises he's found his man. He's found the person that can be the front man to help push through all these changes he just couldn't do in the past. The other thing I realise I should really highlight is that while I'm talking about this 10-year plan, there are actually two separate plans, both with something underpinning it that would form a cornerstone of everything in the years to come. And while the 10-year plan is really the big one, this new philosophy, this new identity, all determined by sports psychology and research, etc., the 2-year building plan from 2010 to 2012 really is recognition that it would only ever work if you had the right players coming into it in the first place. Something the FA officially would refer to later as the future England player. To do this, Sir Trevor Brooking appointed Gareth as the head of elite development. In an interview when he's first appointed in January 2011, I think it's still very clear, even as early as this, what the purpose of the role was and the direction of travel, even if Gareth kind of skips over how involved he was in that list of proposals.
I think after the last World Cup, the FA wanted to be proactive in getting opinion from people throughout the professional game as to how we can best produce more top quality young England players and coaches to benefit the England senior team in the years to come.
A role, by the way, and you're welcome to look this up, only actually existed for those 2 years, just while they did a complete and utter overhaul of the grassroots system. New rules, new regulations, new initiatives like the Elite Player Performance Plan came in, changes in coaching, a complete revamp of all the academies, and they weren't particularly quiet about it. I mean, just take this comment and quote from Gareth in the 2012 Euros. It's very clear what changes they wanted to make and what they hope to get out of it.
But when's it ever going to change? What will change it? I mean, you're involved with the FA and we're changing this with the kids, smaller side pitch. Do you think that will make a change for when we go into a tournament like that? Well,
it won't make a change for 2 years' time, because you've got to start working on kids of 5, 6, 7 years old so that they come through. You can make short-term changes to the way that some of the junior international teams play, but the fundamental skills and game awareness and things, they've got to be embedded in 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Yeah. The academies, the level of coaching's got to be better throughout the game. We ask England managers, we sack England managers, but they can only play with the group they've got. And I think with the group we had this time, we were never going to outplay teams, no matter what system we played.
As I've already mentioned, there is something underpinning each of the plans. In the case of the 2-year plan, it's the construction of St George's Park. Now, St George's Park is not very relevant for this particular question, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But here's a few clips from that 5 Live interview in July, and also its opening, which I think shows how it fits in quite well.
So 210, 2-year building plan, and towards the latter part of then 212, we opened up St George's Park, and that was the big breakthrough.
If you made them better technically, I think the youngsters, as they get into it, will stay in the game.
At the moment it's a building, it's an opportunity, and we've got to bring it to life.
It's using St George's Park as a hub and a base to just enthuse and excite and bring everything to life.
But the work going on here and around the country ensures that maybe in the future we'll be better placed to go into a tournament hoping to win it.
Definitely. I think what we want to do is to create better players, we need better teachers. So how can we create a coaching workforce that inspires and teaches our players to the maximum possible level? And then when we go to major tournaments, hopefully we'll have a bigger pool of players, English players that are playing in the Premier League regularly, getting that experience that they need, that have tournament experience with our junior national teams, so that going to a tournament isn't a surprise to them. Not to say that we can't go there and achieve things, but I think we know that we don't go as favourites, and it would be great to be going into tournaments as favourites.
And the scary part of listening to all these old interviews is how unbelievably spot on they are with their comments and their predictions. And there is actually one that really stands out from that opening of St George's Park. Just listen to what Sir Trevor Brooking says when asked about how he thinks England would do at the 2012 Euros.
We hopefully will make the most in the next 3 tournaments, but I've always said 218, 220 is when I really think we'll have a depth of choice that will start to make us competitive on a regular basis.
And the reason I call these cornerstones is everything in the future always seems to come back to them. So even though I think St George's Park is not very relevant to this question, you know that in every interview, including about his contract, it's going to come up.
Do you think this team is going to reach its peak while you're still in charge? Do you think the next World Cup and the Euros will see this team at its very best and give you a greater chance of winning a first major tournament in 55 plus years?
I think what you hope, and this goes back to what happened when St George's Park was built, you want sustained success. And when we look at the top nations who've won over years and years, Germany, Italy, France, they've had odd fallow periods, but generally they've always been contending for major tournaments.
For this question though, I think it's the other cornerstone that's more relevant, the one underpinning the 10-year plan, the England DNA. To explain it, I think the Football Daily YouTube channel actually has quite a good summary for one of their videos.
He helped launch the England DNA, a document which called for a new footballing identity based on ball retention, pressing and tactical flexibility to be implemented at every level of the national setup.
And when you start looking into things, you realise that this England DNA cornerstone is really what underpins everything. Every change, every decision, every part of the England setup. And in fact, to be honest, everything within the FA as a whole as well. When people use those expressions, for example, the project, the vision, the system, a lot of the time they're even just referring only to the England DNA. The fact that the FA even describe it on their own website as the England DNA project should probably suggest that. And when you start looking into what it is, you start to see also that this really is Gareth's whole philosophy for on and off the pitch. Not just in the style of play, etc., but also things like being connected to the badge, having a pride in playing for England and knowing its history. Things regarding sort of the charity side and some of the politics we see today, that's also in there. And there's a very large emphasis on sports science and sports psychology, as well as supporting players with mental health. So ignoring some of those more common expressions, I think I prefer The Guardian's total Southgate philosophy, or, as Sam Wallace put in The Telegraph more recently, the Gospel of Southgate, as I think that's probably a better reference. And the funny thing I have now found with the England DNA is that every time I'm researching anything related to the FA, I feel like I'm watching an episode of Doctor Who from 2004 again. And I mean that as in, if you're familiar with the series, you'll know that there was a story arc of Bad Wolf and how it's meant to be spread through time and space. And so every single episode, the words will be there. Well, that's kind of how I feel about the England DNA. Whether it's a passing banner or on the background of an interview, it just seems to be everywhere. The England DNA itself was officially created and launched in December 2014 by the newly appointed technical director, Dan Ashworth. Dan Ashworth being another similarly minded person that Sir Trevor Brooking appointed in order to help push the project through. Although I feel it should be noted that this actually wasn't the original plan. You see, the role of technical director is another one of these newly made positions, with the distinct purpose of creating a new philosophy. But originally it was Gareth who was lined up to take it. But then he decided he didn't want it because he didn't want another desk role. He wanted something a bit more hands-on. Then Sir Trevor Brooking, being so worried that he was going to lose his front man, then decided to bring him back as the under-21s manager, therefore working with Dan Ashworth on this new philosophy and really using his under-21s as kind of guinea pigs. This is why Gareth is not only just at the launch in December 2014, but he's also talking about how the England DNA is already bearing fruit within his under-21 team. And in a more recent interview this year with 442, one of those former players from that original team actually talks about how it's quite a change for them. Those that had been the under-21s for quite a while said it was quite a difference when Gareth came in. He introduced a far more relaxed and fun atmosphere. He also introduced a style of football which they considered to be a more European style, and they were happy to buy into. And I think that's probably what Gareth meant after his first game, when he makes the following comment.
Very proud, good to be back involved in the game, and but more importantly, it was nice to see the players carry out so many of the things that we worked on in the week, and they've really embraced that. And we've got another game to test what we're trying to do in 3 days' time.
He then goes on to say that looking at the current England team, it's not just the philosophy, the style of play and the atmosphere that seems familiar to the 2013 setup. Everything is, including the backroom staff, is the same as back then. And again, it's not an accident, it's all deliberately put in place. Just listen to what Sir Trevor Brooking said in that 5 Live interview back in July on the matter.
So, funny enough, I went then to Gareth Southgate and said, look, do you fancy, because he was in Yorkshire, but this is a lot closer to you, do you fancy taking the under-21s down to the under-16s and working and getting them playing the way we want to work? And as luck had it, he agreed to do it, and really then it was just in place, and it was then really, Nick, a case of being patient and waiting for all those coaches and Gareth and the young players coming through working in the clubs, which, as I said, was a 10-year plan, which took us to 2022. But
And I'm not going to go into team selection, but it's no coincidence that there's so many familiar faces in that original team. James Ward-Prowse, Danny Ings, John Stones, Eric Dyer, Harry Kane, Michael Keane, Jesse Lingard were all in that original squad. And as they've all shown, or nearly all have shown, is that while your place is not guaranteed, if you've been in the England DNA longer than the England DNA has actually existed, you do have a slight advantage. This is what Gareth meant when Jesse Lingard made his return in September, and he was asked why. And he said,
He's a player that, for these games in particular, knows how we play.
A concept perhaps that Klopp doesn't really understand when it comes to John Stones. And the survival of the project and understanding the significance of the England DNA and this coming through the system, as it's sometimes referred to, plays a big role in not just the selection of players, but also the appointment of England managers. Because I think when it comes to Harry Redknapp, for example, he may have been the favourite way, way, way ahead of Roy Hodgson. But the reason he was never given a shot, I think, is because of comments he made over the years. It comes up in various articles as well. One particular one stands out just because I think it sums it up so well. When he said this.
He knows the system, knows how the FA works.
What system? What, the losing system? He knows the losing formula.
As I said, I meant that as a summary because I do know that this is 2016. I think when it comes to 2012, which is the time obviously we're talking about, then I think it's other comments he made. For example, he said he hated the idea of spending time at St George's Park, which was one of the key cornerstones. He also called Gareth Southgate and Sir Trevor Brooking tea-drinking FA men, which didn't help. Remembering two things. Number one, this is 2012, right at the beginning of the 10-year plan. And number two, it was Sir Trevor Brooking who was making the appointments. And what's interesting listening to Harry Redknapp is it seems that at the time he didn't really understand this, and over the years listening to his interviews, he still really just doesn't understand the politics of the FA at all.
I was on my way home feeling great, and then the radio come on. There was a news flash, and Roy Hodgson has just been announced as England's manager. Did come completely out of the blue. I had no idea that anything was going to. I thought that at that time that I was pretty sure to get the job.
So no one in the FA thought it might be courteous to at least give you a phone call and tell you that you hadn't got it?
Well, I never went for an interview, I suppose. They probably thought we've got no right. They didn't interview me, and they didn't interview Roy, as far as I know. They just made a decision, the board, whoever they were, decided that he was more suitable to me for the job. But that's their opinion. And
there is one thing he is correct about, though, and that is I cannot find any evidence of them ever interviewing Roy Hodgson. I mean, every interview I've looked at always describe it as an informal chat. And the FA are very, very clear that they didn't ask anybody else. He was the only person they approached. And I think it just is a case that he was a better fit for the project. I think also he has a slight advantage in that coincidentally he just happened to have been working with and become good friends with, actually, a certain Dan Ashworth. The guy that wrote the England DNA. And I don't think they thought he was going to follow the England DNA. I mean, remember, he was appointed, 2.5 years before it's launched. But I think they wanted someone who would be supportive and, of course, be supportive of St George's Park, which literally had just opened. And it brings you back to a comment that Sir Trevor Brooking made. Because remember when he said...
And it was then really, Nick, a case of being patient and waiting for all those coaches and Gareth and the young players coming through working in the clubs.
Because I think that's it. It's almost like, I might be wrong, but I get the impression that he was brought in as a kind of long-term caretaker. Someone who would be very supportive and then also get involved in some of those cultural changes, such as some of the charity work that we just start to see coming into place around this time. I mean, I can't imagine Harry Redknapp, and I especially can't imagine someone like Fabio Capello doing anything like this. And what's also interesting with this charity work, it's the first time we start to see this marrying up between the senior role and the under-21s role. And with this, it makes the whole Sam Allardyce saga of 2016 seem more and more suspicious every time I look at it. Again, we're back to the England DNA because it was just so controversial. It basically created a kind of civil war in the FA at the time. Those that were for it and those that were against it. Greg Dyke, who was the then chairman and probably one of the biggest supporters, who announced the aims for it, in fact, even resigned in the beginning of 2016, saying there was just too much opposition to these kinds of reforms. Perhaps one of the most controversial parts about the England DNA is they cleverly wrote in this line saying that the next England manager should be the current under-21s manager. Almost an automatic promotion within. Well, it's also interesting to see that it's not just those within the FA that wanted to make it clear where they were in this debate. Also, football pundits around the time were getting involved.
I think 2014 they had a vision. They've appointed Dan Ashworth of appointing within. I think they should stick with that. They've got a vision. They've got somewhere to go. So who's the next in line? Gareth Southgate. Now, maybe you have to tweak it a little bit because it's a bit premature. Sorry, right?
Go on, man.
Gareth Southgate's just won a tournament.
Yeah, won the Toulon tournament.
He's just won a tournament. So he knows, he's got experience within tournaments. That's a tournament England hasn't won for 25 years.
But I would like to see us stick with, like, if we're going to do what we said in 2014 and build, and then maybe ease Gareth Southgate in with a Glenn Hoddle type or whoever it is.
With Slaven Bilic.
Then I think we should try and do that and stick with it. Try and stick with what we're trying to do.
The problem with this plan was, just like Sir Trevor Brooking said back in 2012, was they were expecting the talent to come through 2018, 2020. This happened basically 2 years too soon. And those even supporting the England DNA, and I think Gareth even himself, felt this was just a little bit too early. So they had to find an alternative. Of those that were actually available and willing, Sam Allardyce really managed to keep both sides of Civil War happy at the same time. For those that were against the concept, he was the perfect appointment. He was going to bring an end to this England DNA rubbish as they saw it, especially as he himself described it as tippy-tappy nonsense. However, during his interview, he managed to convince even some of the biggest supporters, such as Dan Ashworth himself, that he really bought into this idea of the England DNA. Especially, he was really interested in the idea of St George's Park and he couldn't wait to bring his staff in. Okay, not everyone was convinced, and maybe rightly so, because it was only a matter of literally a couple of weeks before there was a slight change of heart. So it's decided that the junior teams will continue with the England DNA and the senior team will run independent of it. It is literally a matter of about 2 to 3 weeks before that famous sting happens. And we all know what happens next. They decide that his position is untenable and his brief reign as England manager comes to a very abrupt end after only 67 days. But of course, with World Cup qualifiers fast approaching, the FA found themselves in a situation of needing a new England manager in less than 4 days. So back to plan A, bring in Gareth Southgate. Or, as Sir Trevor Brooking put in his 5 Live interview in July,
if you remember, Sam took over the senior side and that, but there was an issue, and so he stepped in then a bit earlier than people might have thought, and then, he's not looked back.
and after 4 games as an interim manager, he decides he wants the job and he has his interview. And I put that in inverted commas because it sounds just like Roy Hodgson. It was less of an interview and more of an informal chat where he presented his vision to 5 people who literally on paper are the biggest supporters of the England DNA, and strange enough is appointed as permanent manager, with Wilkinson even saying, well, we've given him a 2-year contract, but we're looking at 6 years minimum. This is based off these 4 interim games and the vision. And meanwhile, Sam Allardyce feels that he perhaps might have been set up, saying,
unfortunately, it was an error in judgment on my behalf, and I paid the consequences. But, entrapment has won on this occasion, and I have to accept that.
And then a year later, having finally investigated the matter fully, they decided that Sam Allardyce was innocent. And, strangely enough, Sam Allardyce decides to sue the FA for mishandling the situation. Now, for me, this is quite suspicious, especially based on a knowledge of politics. But I think I'm not the only one listening to a certain comment that Ian Wright made last month at one of the World Cup qualifiers.
I don't know. The thing what you have to say with Gareth and what he's done, especially when the job came about, however it came, obviously Sam Allardyce lost out, but the fact is that I don't think I've seen for many, many years somebody who's more suited to a job than Gareth Southgate.
And by the way, please don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say this is a bad thing. In fact, I think quite the opposite. But what I'm trying to highlight is the fact that when we're talking about England managers and contracts with the FA, it's always about politics. And what's more, when it's come to the last 10 to 12 years worth, it's usually been to do with this whole total Southgate England DNA. Something that actually carries through beyond when he's made the permanent manager. To begin with, and I'm not going to go into obviously the whole team selection side, that's for another day, but you can see this 2-year purge of players that he inherited. That actually starts even beforehand when he's an interim manager, because it starts by dropping Wayne Rooney. And then it continues slightly up to and beyond the 2018 World Cup with the likes of, Vardy and Cahill, who spend most of the time on the bench, come back, have a quick chat with Gareth, and then very quickly retire from international football. And I might be wrong, but I kind of get the impression that they saw the direction of travel and decided to jump before they're pushed. Because when you look at this purge, you can see it a bit more visually if you use some pretty little spreadsheets and a bit of colour coding. The values themselves, where they're not important, they're merely to represent how much each player played in each of these campaigns. What you do need to recognise, though, is that that first column is the first campaign of 2017, and then each column is each squad call-up up to the present day. Now, if we just look at those players from 2016, 2017, and compare those that are in yellow, i.e. players that had been inherited by Gareth but had never played under him before, and then compare those to those in purple who had played under him before, you start to see a very stark difference. By the way, the dark green is merely to indicate that they had played under Gareth for more than 2 years at that point. And if you go back to that yellow list, it seems like he wanted to hold on to some of those more experienced players until the World Cup. But within sort of 6 months or so, then it's a very different story. In fact, by 2019, the only players to have survived are Jordan Henderson, Raheem Sterling and Kyle Walker. And if you want to see who took those places, well, go back and compare that yellow list of players that he inherited, and then compare it to the list of players that came through the England DNA, with those being a bit younger in blue, who had only come through the England DNA, and those in pink had actually played under Gareth prior to their senior debut. And of course, I'm not saying it's impossible to not come through the England DNA, because there is quite a few players that haven't. I mean, the likes of Tyrone Mings, Calvin Phillips and Connor Cody are pretty good examples of that. And that 3-to-1 ratio, I think it worked out to be, is again probably not a coincidence. But it probably does explain why Gareth was quite reluctant to take the job in 2016. Because not only did taking that job 2 years too soon mean he missed out on that tournament experience with the Junior World Cups in 2017, but he was also left to try and prove that this strategy and this new idea worked within 4 games with a group of players who just hadn't come through it in the first place. And in a recent interview this year, he said almost like that 2018 team was a kind of stopgap. He had to make do and mend with what he had while he was waiting for his team to come through. Comments that I will use next time because they're more related to team selection, but they are relevant and they link into Sir Trevor Brooking's story. He had always said that Gareth was actually offered an interim position as early as June 2016, but he turned it down due to the fact that it just wasn't enough. They were offering him 1 game, leading the press and the media really with nothing more to say than the following comment.
Gareth Southgate says that, he doesn't want it. Well, that's what we understand. He says he doesn't want the job.
Oh, and when it comes to this purge and this transition of team, well, I think that as much as anything comes back to that other cornerstone like everything else, i.e. St George's Park. And I'm basing this on a comment that Gary Neville made in 2019.
Also, the younger players that are now in the squad, it's all they've ever known. They've never been to the Grove or other hotels before. So what you've now got is a transition from players who used to being at sort of what would be London hotels, who liked it, to players who now in the under 17s, 16s, 18s, 21s, always been at St George's Park. They were always there. They're now coming in, and it does now feel like the vision that was actually wanted in the first place, but it needed that transition away from obviously the players and people who'd been used to being away from there.
Oh, and as for that civil war in the FA over the England DNA, that basically came to an end in 2018 after the World Cup semi-final. And I think that perhaps could be summed up best by Sir Trevor Brooking's appearance on Good Morning Britain around that time.
He has been really spot on at the moment, and the great thing about this tournament now, getting to the quarterfinal, whatever happened, he's going to be there for the next 4 years at least, because everyone knows and can see
I think
where we're heading.
And this basically leads me up to the present day. And why were the FA so desperate to extend his contract? Remember, this is not a new contract. It's the same contract, just extended by 2 years. Part of me wants to say, well, this has never happened before. And then I thought about it and realised I have absolutely nothing to go off. Before the introduction of the Premier League in 1992, the whole of English football and the FA were really different. Since 1992, there have been 9 other England managers, 8 of which never survived the first 4 years. Sven-Göran Eriksson is the only exception, and his extension and contracts were, well, a complete and utter mess, so nothing to go off there. So this is really new territory in many ways. But I do think the FA were really worried he was going to leave. Not because of the whole load of rubbish I was seeing in the media over the summer about how he was going to take, or maybe take, a Premier League job. That was completely ridiculous. In fact, having got rather frustrated with all of this, I decided to write practically an essay on why I thought Gareth was not going to leave. I could think of an entire list of reasons why he was not going to leave at the end of 2022. I could only think of one reason why he might, and that was only a possible, and that was if England were to win the World Cup at the end of 2022. Because remember, the Qatar World Cup at the end of 2022 didn't just mark the end of his current contract, it marked the end of the 10-year plan. And a 10-year plan which Greg Dyke in 2013 set about a few aims for.
Today I want to set the whole of English football 2 targets. The first is for the England team to at least reach the semi-finals of the Euro Championships in 2020, and the second is for us to win the World Cup in 2022.
And due to the fact they expected the talent to come through to the senior team in 2018-2020, there was also one more aim.
On the way, to show we are making progress along, I'd like to see us doing well in the Under-20s World Cup in 2017, with the objective of that squad then moving on to the Under-21 Championships.
That was pretty spot on as well.
But 2017 was the big key time. I hope that has been mentioned, because in 2017, the summer, we won the World Cup under 17s with people like Foden and Sancho playing. In the 18s, we won the Toulon tournament in the same summer. The under 19s won the European Championships. The under 20s won the World Cup, and the under 21s lost in the semi-final on penalties. Of course, it was to Germany, but we had 5 age groups, 4 trophy winners and 1 semi-finalist. So you looked at those 5 years and thought, we've got some great players coming through, and that was the moment you knew, that the next few years are going to be great.
Because I think the FA are looking at this and actually thinking, oh my God, England might win. Okay, maybe they won't, but is that a risk they can afford to take? Because looking at these aims that were set in 2013, they were considered to be unachievable, and yet they've gone above and beyond every single one of them. And if England were to win in 2022, what happens to Gareth? Well, it's job done. Mission accomplished, and everyone can see that basically the only way from here is down. So why would he stay? And then if he goes, what do you do next? So how can we keep him? Well, we can't offer him a new contract. He hasn't even finished his first one. He's got another year to go. But if we offer him a 2-year extension, At least it ties him in for those 2 years and buys us a bit more time. So while people are saying, oh, well, what happened if England bail out after the group stages? I think the FA are less worried about that. I mean, looking at the past, he's got enough brownie points to basically explain why it's worth keeping him. And they're far more worried about him leaving than having to deal with that situation. So why are they worried? Okay, there's the obvious reason. If you have an England manager who is more successful in the last 3 years than the last 50 years put together, you want to keep him. But then there's a bit more. You have to look at the FA pathway. I use the wording the pathway because that's the official FA terminology.
Means that there's a pathway that players are able to come through, and some come through quite quickly to get into Gareth's team.
What I mean by looking at the pathway though is look at how you get into the squad. I don't mean age 16, 17, 18 years old, okay, that's still relevant, but again, not for this question. I mean right back to the very, very beginning. When you're about 6 years old, for example, and you're just joining your first ever team. Because if you do that, you have FA qualified coaches. And remember what Gareth said back in 2012?
Because you've got to start working on kids of 5, 6, 7 years old so that they come through.
So, as of 2018, all of the FA Level 1 qualifications for coaching the age group of age 6 to 11 are now based upon this total Southgate England DNA. You can watch seminars on the matter of coaching it to this age group. You can even watch coaching videos on YouTube, and they will explain how.
If you want to adopt a games-based approach, but still reinforce some of the DNA's key messages, this is a great way to do it.
Or maybe you don't join a club immediately. You go to one of those fun taster sessions, like the ones, for example, by McDonald's. You see people like Frank Lampard, for example, taking part in them. Okay, quick Google search of them. As it's McDonald's who sponsored the FA, of course they're all based around the England DNA again. Either way, you start playing games, but you're under 13 years old, so 11 aside, of course not, because there were a whole load of rules and regulations, such as pitch size and team size, that were all put in place in 2011 by the then head of elite development, Gareth Southgate. And as you play, you get better, and maybe you show promise to be one of those new technical players that these regulations and initiatives have been hoping to produce. So you get scouted by an academy that's part of a system that was completely and utterly overhauled back in 2011, led by, well, again, you probably can guess who. As an example of its influence today, there's one clip I think is quite relevant. About 3 weeks ago, Gareth went and opened the new academy at his former club Crystal Palace. This is how he was introduced.
Someone who, along with the Premier League and Jed Roddy, formulated the very concept of elite football academies in England, bringing the best facilities to the best talent. The success that the England team are enjoying now under his tutelage are not just a product of what he does as a coach, but of the many years that he spent talking people like me into making things like this a reality.
And if you start doing well at those academies and you might become a professional player, then you could join the Elite Player Performance Plan, or also known as the EPPP. Bit of a controversial one, I know, but looking at the current squad, nearly all of those younger players have come through that initiative. An initiative that was launched in 2011 by the then, well, you can see where this is heading. And if you're doing really well at the age of, say, 14, 15, 16, you might get selected to join one of the England junior teams. Therefore, you get to play at St George's Park. You know, that place where the construction began the same day, coincidentally, that Gareth started at the FA. And I'm sure you can guess who Sir Trevor Brooking put in charge to oversee its construction from beginning to end. And as a junior international, your progress is therefore tracked, and that information is usually fed into the senior manager. Just an example, there's an article that talks about how they were planning a route for Jude Bellingham to get into the senior team when he was as young as about 14 or 15 years old. It's also what Gareth meant just before the San Marino game when he said that they had been tracking Conor Gallagher for quite a while.
Been very impressed with him. We've tracked Conor for quite a long time.
And I'm not going to go any further with this pathway because it goes on a lot longer. And I think that's far more relevant to, say, team selection. And of course, more particularly, the whole Callum Hudson-Odoi situation at the moment. But where I think it fits in, and I'm now going to quote one of the commentators at the San Marino game, where this conveyor belt of talent does fit in, is the fact that it was deliberately designed in order really to get around time constraints by building a team for the manager before they arrive in the team. So that when they do arrive in that team, they already know the manager and the manager knows them. They already know the philosophy, the backroom staff, the players and everything else. So they just sort of fit into place really quickly and really easily. Which begs the question, what happens when the manager at the end is not the manager who built the conveyor belt in the first place? Because it might work out, but no one's tested it yet. And when you look at this current team, and then you look at how things were back, before 2016, I think it's a question the FA just don't have the courage to ask and don't really want to find out yet. And while that maybe explains why they've been so desperate to extend this contract by 2 years, I realise it doesn't explain how Gareth seems so reluctant, and that strange date of December and how it doesn't really fit in. Which leads me to my digging and how I ended up on the FA's new strategy plan they have in place. And the reason I start doing this digging is really due to Gareth's change in attitude. Back in 2018, England got to their first semi-final of the World Cup in 28 years. Gareth had a lot of bargaining chips if he wanted to use them, but he didn't. He just signed the contract and it went through really easily. All of a sudden now he wants to negotiate. So what's changed? Well, we're talking about a contract for an England manager, so it has to be political. And when you start to look into it, you can see there is a political shift. The key part being that all the way through, there's always been this group at the top who have been so supportive of the project. For example, Martin Glenn as the executive director, Dan Ashworth as the technical director. In Gareth's interview back in 2016, they're both present, both being very supportive. When they renewed his contract in 2018, they're both present, being very supportive. But they've both left. In fact, of that original group of reformists, Gareth is now the only one who's still there. So who came in their place? Well, it's clear from his comments that John McDermott, who's the new technical director, is very supportive. But I wasn't so sure about either Mark Bullingham, who is the new executive director, or either James Kendall, who is the new director of football development. That's why I started to look at their new strategy plan, because I wanted to find out their ideas and the direction of travel. And it's very different to the ones that have been before. You see, in all of those previous strategy plans from 2010 to 2019, there's always a very clear section that seems to be around that, shall we say, conveyor belt of talent. A clear part that is clearly dedicated to coaching and player development. But in the current strategy plan, it's just not there. There's a bit about grassroots football, particularly about pitches, but that is word for word the same in all the others. And the rest about inclusion and almost wanting to seem like they're promoting the FA brand. Straight away, I did wonder how Gareth felt about this. And interestingly enough, this came out in January 2021. Only a couple of months before Gareth said he wanted to negotiate his new contract. But it's dated from 2020. So I thought it might be interesting to see what happened in that year before, to see if there's anything I missed when it came to coaching. Funny enough, due to COVID and financial issues, a lot of those initiatives found their funding cut. And there are a few of these. I mean, for example, the coach mentoring scheme. But the one that really stood out to me was the fact they cancelled the funding for Futsal, as I knew Gareth was a really big supporter of that in order to develop these technical players he wanted. Thus, to me, it wasn't a big surprise to find only a couple of days later a new article where someone even said that this would put Gareth's team back about 20 years. Yeah, of course, Gareth's been quite quiet on this, but he did actually offer to take a 30% pay cut in order to help finance this, along with a few other similar initiatives. So taking this into account, I'm also then going to quote Gary Neville from 2019.
I think that the fact that he's been in the FA for 4 or 5 years, he understands it, he understands the politics of it. It's not easy.
And I think that's true. He understands the politics and he recognises how strong his hand is. I think he's looking at the last sort of 10 years and all the effort he's put in and thought, this is now going a different direction, and these negotiations and this contract is the perfect opportunity to get things back on track. Back in August, I also just got the impression that they were going to start throwing money at him. Just from reading, it felt like they didn't understand him, and they thought by offering more money was a guaranteed way for him to stay. So when those articles came out, I think last month, about doubling his contract or the idea of doing so, I wasn't surprised because I already predicted that. And of course, that was clearly not going to work because you could tell how that discussion was going to go. The FA would throw money at him, hoping it would encourage him to stay, all while saying that they still couldn't afford those initiatives. And Gareth's response is going to be, well, great, don't give me the money, put it into those initiatives instead. That's why I put these comments on YouTube as a sort of a prediction that not only is it more interesting now to look at what comes out of the FA, but I didn't think there would be a base salary increase because of it. And then I suddenly thought, that's going to be a bit of a surprise. And how are the FA going to get around that? Because with all these articles coming out, it's going to raise questions. But of course, Mark Bullingham's managed to get around that because he chose to put out this statement.
I understand people will ask how we can afford this given the financial losses at the FA. And whilst I'm not going to go into details on the contract, I will say that it's a performance-related contract and any rises or increases in bonuses are self-funded by either increases in commercial revenue or tournament prize money.
And it's a very clever one because his description actually is of any contract before without a salary increase. But it implies that there is one. And by refusing to go into the details, then you can push those questions away, even though it's still completely at odds with all of those articles that were coming out. In my opinion, I think the most telling comment actually is the one that came afterwards when he said this.
Both Gareth and Steve understand that and wanted it that way. They genuinely care about the organisation.
So I am curious to see what comes out of the FA. And I'm also curious to see if there's any friction, because if I'm right, then this is the first time we've had an England manager dictating what the FA does rather than the other way around. And I'm not really sure how that's going to go down. Oh, and by the way, one more thing about that strategy plan. It happens to finish in December 2024. That date sounds familiar, doesn't it? Admittedly, take that as you will, because I do have a few ideas, but at this moment I need to do more research because it's just speculation. But anyway, overall, and just as a sort of conclusion, going back to my iceberg theory, if any of this or a lot of this has been new to you, I would advise you go back and watch that whole press conference because I think you're going to start to see things in a very different light.